Well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new Ghostbusters film, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So when there's something strange in the neighborhood, who you gonna call? Well, there's a bunch of Hollywood execs that really hope that the answer to that question is still Ghostbusters, because kind of following after 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife, which kind of rebooted the iconic franchise 37 years after the last film, the Ghostbusters are back, ready for another ghost-busting adventure. And kind of like the last one, Ghostbusters Afterlife, uh, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire does attempt to strike that very delicate balance between kind of tugging on the nostalgia for the original 1980s films while also bringing something that's fresh and new and exciting for kind of the next generation of Ghostbuster fans. And at least to me, I think the results of that attempt are somewhat of a mixed bag. And probably more than I can remember for a film in quite some time, this film did leave me very much kind of indifferent. I can go either way with this. I did like a lot of this movie. There's things that maybe I didn't like about it, but most of all, I thought this was just fine. It was sort of good for what it was. And I think this movie, it does offer a lot of very endearing, kind of fun characters, but it's just bogged down by a very convoluted and kind of meandering plot. I think overall it can offer just some simple, diverting entertainment and does have some successful humor and gags, although I think there are also some content areas that might spook away some Christian audiences. So Afterlife very heavily leaned into nostalgia, kind of treating every reveal of a classic character or vehicle or like proton pack almost as something like sacred. And kind of in contrast to that, I do think Frozen Empire does feel just more natural. The original cast members are better integrated into the overall stories, and there's just fewer moments, although there are some, where the film sort of halts all of its forward momentum to kind of ask audiences like, hey, remember that? Hey, remember this thing or this character? And this kind of a bunch of Easter eggs. I think because of that, it may not provide the same like as deep of like an emotional kind of resonance as sort of the more nostalgic last film. But I think overall, it does seem to stand kind of more confidently on its own 2 feet. And probably the biggest strength that this movie has going for it is its characters, both the returning legacy characters, as well as sort of the new batch of Ghostbusters that was introduced in the last film. And despite what becomes a very crowded cast, I do think every one of the characters, for the most part, does get their moment to shine, with the exception perhaps of Finn Wolfhard's character, which is relatively sidelined compared to sort of the other new core of characters. And I just enjoyed sort of that intergenerational dynamic between the legacy characters and the new characters, and even just the family, like the parents and the kids of the new cast. And it does just result in some very wholesome, kind of crowd-pleasing moments, particularly when it comes to like the third act. Unfortunately, while the characters are compelling, the story around them isn't always as interesting. And in some ways, Frozen Empire almost feels like a movie that has two first acts before kind of quickly jumping to a more exciting, rushed third act climax. Because this plot unfolds at a very sort of slow and meandering pace, which again, the original Ghostbuster films weren't exactly brisk speed themselves, but there is this sort of a lot of heavy kind of exposition dialogue dumps that don't get much payoff. And even like the evil kind of godlike spectral villain in this doesn't actually like appear in the story like physically until about an hour and a half into the 2 hour runtime, and kind of all the exciting like city freezing action that has been featured so prominently in like the marketing material and the trailers is almost all reserved for just that final 30 minutes of this film. And while spending time just with the characters and sort of having them banter is fun, I think people that are looking for more things to actually happen in the plot will be somewhat frustrated by this film, as evidenced by the man that sat beside me and snored through the majority of this film. Because like for example, there's kind of a mysterious orb like at the center of this film, and you get multiple scenes of like characters sort of standing around just sort of explaining the history and thinking of like the world ending, the dangerous sort of potential of this object. And you get far fewer scenes of like actually seeing this object do anything dangerous or kind of show off the its potential. And there's sort of like another entire subplot which is going to get a lot of screen time dedicated to it, about these kind of historical ancient fire warriors, and like, just that plot doesn't contribute really anything of consequence to the actual kind of storyline and the plot, beyond just an excuse to sort of get a fun actor in there for just a couple jokes. I might not even need to mention that we're 4 films into this franchise, but like the other films, Frozen Empire is much more a comedy than it is like a horror film, despite featuring like undead and ghost kind of spectral characters. There are some sort of light, spooky elements, mostly like the creature design of these ghosts, but nothing more intense than you would find at like Disneyland's Haunted Mansion ride. Kind of on the other hand, I do think the comedy elements mostly work. They do capture sort of the sardonic humor of the original films, which does land very clearly in the like quietly chuckle to yourself territory, rather than any kind of laugh out loud jokes. And at times, the film does, at least it did to me, feel like kind of a fun throwback to the days of the classic kind of live action, sort of family friendly Disney films, both sort of tonally and also just the fact that this movie centers on an actual family of characters. But despite that, there also are some content elements, which we're going to get into in just a second, that I think particularly the Christian audiences may want to put back into the ghost trap. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this film, for language, I counted maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 kind of minor profanities all throughout. And I think God and maybe Jesus also get sort of used once or twice as well. As far as violence, there are some deaths, although nothing, at least to me, that seemed like overly gratuitous in how it was presented. Because several characters are frozen by what this film calls the death chill, where they get all sort of frozen like a big icicle before the villain sort of shatters them, which leads to like exploding ice heads and bodies, and in one case like a dismembered hand. But there is no blood, and these characters are sort of these like big ice blocks when that happens. Probably where there's the most content in this film is with sexuality. There's one scene, kind of a drawn out gag, where the characters are in this sort of hidden, mysterious room, and they all begin to joke that it is in fact a sex chamber, which it's not. But there's several gags sort of that keeps building on that kind of that premise. And kind of in close to that scene, there is another character is kind of commenting on a painting on the wall, which is featuring some bare-chested characters, and this character refers to it as being nipply and comments how she enjoys that about the film. And while ultimately left up to interpretation and left slightly vague, there is sort of a very central kind of plot point, subplot between a teenage girl and then the ghost of a teenage girl that is very strongly implied to involve like a romantic attraction between them, which leads the human girl to attempt to become a ghost in order that they can have sort of a deeper connection. And even in one scene, it seems like they're just like on the verge, perhaps, of kissing. And while the film itself can be interpreted just as a close bond of sort of female friendship, it does seem that there was intended to be slightly more read into that situation. Then the only other kind of thing is there are a few just sort of sexual jokes and things that are thrown out. Some of them were already featured in the trailers, like a sort of a horned supernatural being kind of being described in a clear innuendo as being tall, dark, and horny. As far as worldviews, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, this movie is unlikely to have been intended as any kind of deep exploration into, real world spiritual realities. I think ghosts populate this film because ghosts are fun and the Ghostbusters need things to battle. But that being said, I do think there are some interesting elements in the way that this film does kind of approach the supernaturalism that is at the core of its story. Because Dr. Raymond, who is Dan Aykroyd's kind of legacy character from the originals, is very much an open-minded character to the point that he seems to lack any kind of unifying belief system. Because as he tells another character, he just seems to find it better to just believe in everything so that he has all of his bases covered. And obviously in the real world, such a person would likely quickly be dismissed as like a conspiracy theorist or just sort of a lunatic. But obviously in the context of this film, he's correct in his beliefs and all these Ghost, and his sort of that spiritual openness of his character does lead to some interesting conversations just about, belief in the unknown and sort of supernatural. Although his sort of everything is true mindset will probably be less agreeable to Christians. His characters do make several like direct references to kind of biblical narratives, like they refer to the strength of Samson or like the burning bush as experienced by Moses. Although the implication in the film is that they're not like the product of, the biblical God, but merely just sort of one more example of supernatural activity in a world that's filled with it. And in an interesting way, it seems like almost all the characters in this film appear to be like atheists, although not materialists. And by that I mean like they accept that there is sort of spiritual or reality, although none of them seem to attribute that to the existence of like God or a God. Because there are several kind of conversations between different characters about like the afterlife and what happens to spirits when like they move on from this world. And kind of in one of those, one of the characters sort of points up like invoking heaven, although it seems for the most part these characters hold a far more like, a scientific viewpoint that kind of spiritual beings merely sort of dissolve and just become part of the fabric of the universe, which just leads to a Ghostbusters universe in which like spirits fill the earth, but there's seemingly nothing kind of spiritual that exists beyond the earth, and kind of the spirits on earth and ghosts, like they linger because they're tethered just due to like, emotional attachment to various like physical objects in their life, but nothing beyond that. And for just an entertaining, movie about ghosts, I think those mechanics are perfectly functional for the story. But maybe for Christians, kind of looking beyond that, I do think it provides a kind of a compelling picture of just sort of spirituality without any kind of foundation, and I do think reflects some of kind of modern mindsets that does seem to want to reduce sort of the spiritual merely to our own personal subjective emotions and feelings rather than accept and kind of look to any kind of larger objective reality beyond us. So overall, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire kind of drives its ectomobile right down the middle as a movie that really is neither bad nor great. I can kind of go either way with this film. I think there's enough effective like entertainment and humor to warrant future Ghostbusting stories kind of with this new cast, and I'd be on board for seeing that. But there's also kind of enough apathy and just wheel spinning to suggest that maybe Hollywood has finally like wrung all the juice out of this franchise, and a lot like the kind of the wandering goats in the story, perhaps it is time just to move on. But hey, I'd love to hear what you think. If you're a big Ghostbusters fan or you're just joining these stories from the recent reboots, jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Got lots of movie reviews, got a new podcast, Faith and Pop Culture, every week. Got some interviews. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.